G'day all. We're lucky enough to be joined today by the legendary Jacques Vallee. We've recently published Jacques' classic book, Messengers of Deception, UFO Contacts and Cults, as a Kindle ebook. And Jacques has been kind enough to take time to chat about the book with us and associated topics, probably. Welcome, Jacques.
Well, I don't know whether to say good morning or good afternoon. Say happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving
and
to you.
Same to you. Just by opening up, I just wanted to ask Jacques, you open Messengers of Deception by speculating how the real secret kept by the intelligence community about UFOs is that they were only pretending to know everything about them. But in reality, they knew nothing, despite having probably more data on them than anybody else. After the 2017 revelations and all the speculation regarding legacy programs, has your opinion on that changed?
My opinion has been reinforced by Congress of all people, because they've said exactly that we know now that there is a real mystery. That we've heard the director of the CIA saying that this was not explained by any of the systems that they monitored, and but we still don't know very much about what it is. And in fact, watching the debates and watching the interaction with witnesses in chambers reminds me absolutely of what it was like 50 years ago. Probably certainly you two and most of your listeners weren't there 20 years ago watching the panels before Congress, but Dr. Hynek testified, Carl Sagan testified, Dr. MacDonald testified, and the questions were exactly the same. What do you think it is? How can we distinguish from balloons? And then skeptics would come up and say, no, we can explain all of that with shooting stars and so on. And we're going through the same thing now. But so in history, that never happens. It's never quite the same thing, because we have we have better sensors. I think that's the main difference. The jets today are equipped with exquisite physical instruments to determine what it is that they are chasing, whether it's friend or foe, and also the communication is with the ground, but also with AWACS at higher altitude, and all of that is well documented. So it's not the same thing. But what I hear, and I think that those are very honest statements, is that there is a mystery. We can now state that, but we still don't know where it belongs. Does it belong to atmospheric physics in some way? Is it a cosmic phenomenon of some sort, or are these objects? But they've pretty much excluded, and they said on the record, these are not Chinese and these are not Russian. So we've made some progress, but in terms of research, we have not learned anything new about the identity or about the characteristics.
Like, for example, in your journals, you speculated that the 1990 wave in Belgium was the cause of man-made craft, the triangular craft that flew over cities. So do you think some of these could actually be craft built by someone here on this planet, some government or some?
Well, if you follow the technical literature, if you read the Aviation Week and aviation magazines, that's entirely within what we can do. There was there was an investigation by the French CNES, the space agency, about the Belgian triangles. Now, those were fairly small machines. They were not like the large triangles, the large dark triangles that people are seeing now. They were the size of a large truck, for example, or even smaller than that, the size of a big car. And they evolved at very high speeds, and they had lights on them, and they were entirely within Belgium at the time, except for one. And if you look at the map, you'll see that the border between France and Belgium goes like a sine wave. It goes like this. And there was one object that landed in France. So France felt that they could send somebody there without violating any international sensitivities. And they, actually, a friend of mine went there and took some samples. There were traces on the ground and so on, and in the grass. And he immediately, and they came to the conclusion that this was a flying machine, that was a human flying machine. Now, the best speculation I've heard, no, I'm not an expert in this, but the best speculation I've heard was that those were essentially robot hard balloons that could stand, and if you were going to have a local engagement, not a full war, but a local engagement, for example, with terrorist organizations and so on, and you needed something that would be a relay for communication over a large zone or over a large city. These things were dirigibles, and they could stop and just hover for a long time at high altitude, so they couldn't be shot down. And that idea was reinforced by the fact that when the war started in Iraq, when we started bombing Iraq, all these triangles seen in Belgium were seen on trajectories that brought them back to Germany. And after that, there was nothing more in Belgium. The whole wave stopped. So the implication was that they were testing it in Belgium and that it was redirected to the Middle East when the war started, which makes sense. I mean, these would be fairly inexpensive machines, no pilots, so you're not engaging human life, and they could monitor, an area where there was combat.
Interesting.
Now, that's a speculation. I don't know anybody who has, proven that or endorsed that, but the sequence of events tends to indicate that.
In terms of like investigating cases like that in Messengers of Deception, you criticized the Carter administration's decision to ask NASA to deal with the UFO problem. I'm just wondering, with the recent news that NASA is being engaged to investigate the phenomenon, do you still have that problem with NASA being involved?
At the time, I was working with Professor Sturrock at Stanford. We were working on some NASA research as well. So we had very good contacts with NASA, with the scientists at NASA. And Professor Sturrock was very intrigued and wanted to bring help if NASA wanted help. And so I went to Washington and I met with fairly high-level people at NASA that we knew. And they were fairly, they were trying not to get the assignment. They didn't feel that, number one, that, their budget is voted by Congress on a year-to-year basis. So they have no long-term view for any excess funds that they can allocate to just a new idea that the president has. You know, if the president wants that, he should allocate a special budget for that, but it's not. And the NASA budget was very constrained. It still is, as you may know. So this was not something they wanted to do. And also the NASA doesn't have the ability to respond to public, you know, to the kind of public demand that those would. The Air Force can, because the Air Force has spokespeople in every part of the country, but NASA doesn't. So it would all land on 2 or 3 people at headquarters who didn't really have the information. One journalist was amused by this in Washington, and he came out with absolutely a classic statement that I always remembered, said that the presidential request sent the space agency into a flurry of alarmed paralysis. So the idea of alarmed paralysis was with NASA for a long time. They were very much afraid that they would be forced to do that. Of course, the Air Force wanted to get rid of it, and that's why there had been that study in Colorado, and finally the Air Force was rid of it and could fly airplanes again instead of tracking UFOs and weather balloons. So today, I think the first attempt to engage NASA resulted in, what the Americans call a nothing burger. That wasn't very tasty. They got a group together to study who had never really looked at the question. As you know, there are hundreds of thousands of cases in the computers and so on. They didn't have time to even look at 10 of them. But these were scientists who expressed some ideas about how you would build a methodology to do that. But with NASA, you have to look, as within a government, you have to look at the budget. The budget for that presidential study was $100,000. Okay, so you can't even buy a high-end car for that amount of money. Okay, yeah. So that tells you something. So DARPA put in some money behind it. They put, I think, $1 million, so that the study had a little bit more, reality to it, and they came up with some interesting opinions. I think now NASA is more ready to engage. Remember that the administrator is a former astronaut of long-standing and great experience, and his last statements indicated that he was intrigued by the subject. But again, knowing where NASA is spending its money right now, which is very constrained, I don't see somebody would have to change their budget with a special allocation to do this, and then they would have to recruit people, because within NASA you do not have much of the capability to do a full study of this. When you look at the psychological aspects, they do have psychologists and they do have biologists, of course, because of the human, program, but it's very focused, and it doesn't cover the areas you would have to cover.
Right, like in Messengers of Deception, you were worried that NASA wouldn't look into some of the most important aspects of the phenomenon, like, for example, the physiological effects that are caused by a UFO encounter, whether detrimental in the case of, burns or other things like what happened with the witnesses in Brazil, or sometimes even cases in which the health of the witness is improved, with cases that you investigated yourself, the famous Dr. X case in France. I think there was another one that you mentioned in your books, Jacques Vallee. So, yeah, obviously, NASA has a very narrow idea of what the phenomenon is supposed to be. These expectations, obviously, coming from outer space, right? The ETH. And I think that maybe we need to go through other institutions like academia. Academia is now obviously more open to entertaining the UFO problem, and there seems to be more progress in that regard in the recent years. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, remember that from the point of view of the public, the cases that make a big impact are the close encounters. And the close encounters are not tracked to outer space. The objects appear essentially on the spot. They are seen interacting with animals or people and the environment, and then they lift off, and as in the case at Valençol, it disappeared about 20 meters away from the witness, and it just vanished. And again, those are the cases that, to my mind, are the most pregnant, the most important in terms of new physics. How do you do that without sound, without special effects around it, without I have personal reports from people who did not want to be on record, but were highly competent people who ran companies, in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, who told me that they and their families had seen objects flying at fairly low altitude, at treetop level, and then merging with the atmosphere and disappearing on the spot as they were moving slowly. Okay, this is not something, and the skeptics or some of my science friends say, well, if they go off very fast, the eye cannot follow. That's true, but they were not going fast. They were moving slowly, when you could see what people call windows. You could see lights on it, and then you could still see the lights, but you couldn't see the object anymore. And this is in a clear sky. And then the lights themselves go dim and they disappear. And this has merged with the atmosphere. I mean, or it has gone completely out of our space-time, which is not surprising for, a physicist. I mean, there are theories about that are taught in school, but to me, that's why UFOs are interesting. They give us a proof of a theorem, a proof of a theory that we can study. But first, we have to gain the trust of the witnesses. And today, the witnesses who see that kind of thing are not stupid enough to report it to anybody.
But that was, I was kind of thinking in terms of, you've investigated a lot of high strangeness and close encounter aspects. And you used to hear a lot about that back, in the contactee era and the 70s, but you don't hear so much about it anymore. Is that the reason, that people are just too scared to come forward?
So I've wondered about that. If you look carefully, you'll see that those cults still exist, but they have moved to another dimension themselves by moving to the internet. So they moved to the internet dimension, and now they can have members, in Africa, in Asia, in Siberia, in Canada, in Australia, everywhere. And they don't need to advertise as much. They don't need to march down the streets of San Francisco, chanting their messages to the aliens. They can do that in cyberspace, which is a lot easier, and they still exist. and including some of the cases, some of the sects that I had tracked in Messages of Deception. So they have not disappeared. If anything, some of their speculation has moved into the scientific language more and more, because science has moved towards them in a way. I mean, if there are now things that can appear, disappear on the spot, and so on, then maybe some of the people were describing that we thought were under the influence of drug or under were sort of dreams and visions. Maybe those have a basis of something in reality that we haven't discovered yet. So they are still there. And I think if there is disclosure, that's one of the dangers, that it would release all of that and it could overwhelm the articulated scientific debate that we imagine, that we'd like to have.
That brings me to another question. Like in Messengers of Deception, you sounded the alarms to the real dangers of UFO cults rising from the, shall we say, the left-wing counterculture of the 1970s, and how science's failure, along with government military, to provide answers to the public left a vacuum in which these cult leaders could prosper. But in the modern days, this seems to have flipped completely, and the dominant cult-like behavior in many parts of the world comes from the extreme right. Like many of the young people, especially young men who are listening to podcasts and influencers like, the influencers who promote Bob Lazar are the same ones who promote the dangers of vaccines and other conspiratorial or anti-science views, So, I don't know, what are your thoughts on that trend? Like in the 1970s, this type of rhetoric came from the, 70s anti-government counterculture, and now it seems to come from the right-wing government culture.
I think that the government, whatever that is, but the official statements always pushing there have been 3 times in history where, quote, disclosure could have taken place. Okay, and in the late 50s, early 60s, certainly in the days when I was working with Dr. Hynek, there could have been a disclosure, a disclosure that, like we have now, that there is something and we don't know what it is, and it's very interesting, and people would have taken it in stride with the new things in science, the new satellites going to the moon, the success of the moon missions, all of that. That could have been part of that. And we could have taught some science, to the public in terms of that. Yes, well, science is about mysteries. We don't pay scientists to redo the experiments that we know work, the experiments we've done 50 years ago. We pay them to look at the things we don't understand yet. And so that would have been, to me, I mean, that's what I know what Dr. Hynek expected and was looking for and was trying to work towards. That didn't happen. So the Air Force got tired of having to do all this useless work, and there was a Condon report. The Condon report could have been an opportunity. Professor Condon could have left the door open. And to some extent, he tried to do that. He didn't say there was nothing. He said, there is not enough for science to really invest in this now. That's essentially, which was understood to mean that there was nothing and we can move on. Okay. That was a misunderstanding. But of course, that's what certainly the government wanted, to be rid of the whole thing and move on. So that was a second missed opportunity. But in the meantime, people continue to see things, and people know that those things are real now. And there is more and more evidence for it in their environment, on farms, on the land, on roads, and so on. People are seeing all this. So there is a disruption in the discourse between people and the government. And I think that's dangerous, and it didn't need to come to that. But now the people are not necessarily going to believe what they are told, even if they are told that they are given some explanation for what's going on. There is the belief is much deeper.
And do you think, like in modern day with the internet influencers and podcasters, are they stepping into that gap that's left by science to try and influence people's beliefs?
I think people will trust more the independent broadcasters who admit their mistakes occasionally and try to follow and try to ask the right questions, rather than official statements, because official statements are going to be constrained by security, because there is a large amount, as we all know, that has not seen the light of day, as a senior senator told the press one day. And that's not necessarily unexpected. I mean, there are things that legitimately should remain secret. So I'm not saying, let's open everything and, because for one thing, we don't know how to do that, but we don't have the categories. And a lot of the work that, we can imagine has been going on that is still classified is by definition very complex. And it cannot be released with a few general statements.
Mm-hmm. In the most recent senatorial hearing, Senator Gillibrand stated, "I've met with people who have thousands of examples, thousands of data," meaning UFO reports. Was she talking about you?
I'm not the only one who has worked on that. As you may know, I was part of the Bigelow classified project, and I was in charge of the catalogs. And we built a data warehouse, accumulating known cases and new cases from all over the world. So we had translators from Russian, Portuguese, French, Spanish, and, on the team, and then investigators who could go out and get it. That is, I'm not telling you any secret. We did that. That database is still classified, but yes, it's 280,000 cases that have been have gone through the first level of examination. In other words, it's not just, a kid who saw the moon rising through the fog, or something like that, or a balloon. But that still would have to be exploited to extract the best cases that you could turn over to scientists. And that hasn't been done because the project stopped after 2 years. So that's the status of it. But the cases are there. There are other people who have built catalogs as well. And obviously, this is something that somebody could start from again.
In light of that, I wanted to ask you about your opinion of Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick. I don't know, have you talked to him? Because as an outsider, there seems to be like some kind of like cognitive dissonance to what the public is receiving on all these hearings. It's almost like, I don't know, Sean Kirkpatrick telling to his kids, sorry, kid, despite how much we've investigated, there is no evidence of Santa Claus. And then you have the other people who saying, you know, not only there is a Santa Claus, but he left you a pony buried, you know, beneath all this horse manure that we found, and we need your help to dig it up. So it's a bit of a cognitive dissonance that I find puzzling. So I don't know. What is your take on this?
Well, I think it's fairly natural that people would bring their own opinions. I think people who have seen UFOs or UAPs, especially at close distance, now that includes scientists, it includes business people, it includes financial tycoons and a couple of high-level legislators. So it's natural that people would argue about that, just like they argued about, was COVID a real epidemic, or was it fake, or was it part of something else, and or was it just a monkey that escaped from somewhere in China? People are entitled to their opinions based on their experience, good or bad, and I think that's natural. But the purpose of the scientific investigation, especially if it's paid for by the state, should be to establish some points of verified knowledge. And so far, that hasn't happened.
Mm-hmm.
Talking about the Colares cases that I mentioned before, I don't know if you have followed the recent news about more recent cases happening not only in Brazil, but also in Peru. I think it was in 2023 that some indigenous tribes were complaining to the authorities that they were being harassed by these men in like flying contraptions. Like they describe them using popular culture references like the Green Goblin in the Spider-Man movie. And then the authorities like debunked the cases. They say they were only illegal loggers, like trying to scare the villagers, which to me, as a Mexican, seems totally ridiculous. Mexico has a lot of illegal logging, and they don't perform that kind of like theatrics. If they want to get rid of villagers that are in the way of their business, they just kill them. Simple as that. So I don't know. Have you followed those newer cases in that part of the world?
Not recently, but I'm working on book number 6 in the Forbidden Science series, and you'll see that a few years ago I went back to Brazil, and I went to Argentina, and I went to some other countries, and I think that kind of situation continues. And but I went there with a different, having learned something from the earlier trips that I took, much more specific, not just to learn generally what people were seeing and how they reacted, but really trying to focus on the interaction, and especially in Brazil on claims of people being killed. And Brazil is very complex. The culture is very rich and very complex in its richness, both in terms of belief systems that impinge on the interpretation of the cases. and also on how things are reported in different parts of the country, which is, as you know, larger than the United States. So the question is, what is the right methodology to really have access to this? What I could do in a couple of weeks, or in 3 weeks, or a month, wasn't enough to really get to your question, I think. This is where I think the right methodology would be to create groups of people who knew the countries. I would not go to Brazil today. The only reason I took 3 or 4, actually 4 trips to Brazil was that I was going with people who knew Brazil, had lived there, were including Americans who had lived there and worked there, and obviously spoke the language and had contacts. So we knew how to operate in a way that was conducive to good contact with the local population, that they would accept us, they would understand why we came, they would understand that we were not just, Americans looking to make money exploiting whatever they were saying, and that we were truly doing research. And that was very rich, but you need several teams like that, South of Brazil has a culture that's very different from the Amazon, obviously, and from the culture around Rio de Janeiro. So what we have and what we hear are bits and pieces of things where somebody has sent a team of 3 people or 4 people to gather some records and bring them back. So I think that's still an open field. I don't have a good answer to your question.
Just one of the things that stood out, just to change the subject a little bit, in Messengers of Deception that everyone remarks on is how you brought up the Heaven's Gate cult basically before everyone else knew about them. You investigated the 2 people behind that in the 1970s, and wasn't until the 1990s that there was a mass suicide of 39 members. Just wondering, do you think anything could have been done by authorities in the intervening years to avert that tragedy, or do you just have to let those sorts of things play out, and no matter how tragic they become?
I don't think the lessons have been learned. And I had attended I knew some people who I had been contacted by some people who had members of their family essentially lost to the family because they had gone off with the sect at the beginning in the Midwest. And then in California, that happened again, and I continued to engage with them, trying to understand the process by which, I related in one of my books a meeting at Stanford on campus, where the 2 leaders of the sect, with 2 of their followers and gay who had left their family, had left everything to follow them, were trying to recruit Stanford students to come join the sect, leave their family, leave their studies behind. So that inspired me to the extent that I had a voice at the time with radio and with the publication of my books to try to warn people about that. And that's why and most people in ufology said, in serious study of UFOs, said, well, these people, what can you do? They're crazy, they're saying those things, and that's always been like that, and it doesn't matter, they are wrong. Well, we may believe they are wrong, but they were recruiting believers. Several hundred people were now all across the country listening to them and listening to nobody else, not to their parents, not to their peers, not to their teachers, not especially not to the government, because they thought that there was something coming that was imminent. And that sense of imminence is still here now. I mean, look at how often people say, we're about to have disclosure, next week. And, we have a national election and the new president. Of course, the first thing he's going to do is to disclose, which is possible. But we've heard that before. And the imminence was enhanced at the time for the followers of Heaven's Gate. It was a beautiful movement. When you look at what they were saying, it was very pure. It was a rejection of all the dirty things in American culture. Let's go back to basics. Let's go back to, living in the country, having a sane, clean life, and worshiping the other level of, of thought and consciousness, and because they are coming to get us. And then what precipitated it was somebody I think in Florida, was tracking a comet. And he was tracking a comet with a telescope that he had built. And, I can identify to that because I built my own telescope when I was a kid, and it wasn't very good. Well, his telescope wasn't very good. And it gave a double image of the comet. And he thought that something was following the comet at the same speed as, which is a very high speed, which meant it was a spaceship. And then people started endorsing, that statement, going on TV, including, unfortunately, some people who were highly visible at the time because of their books or because of their media presence, and they were believable. They did not go check the telescope. I mean, the thing to do is you go there and you sit down with the kid at night and you look through his telescope and you do some test of the lenses. And nobody did that. And astronomers didn't do that because it was so obvious to them that they didn't need to go there. They were looking at the comet, and there was only one comet. There was nothing tracking the comet, and they knew that. So they thought, well, this kid, needs to learn more about building telescopes. And that, but the people who took it seriously should have looked or should have asked somebody to go check. And that resonated with the cults. The cult said, this is it, I mean, the spaceship is following the comet and it's going to land here and pick us up. And so we need to die so that our souls can be lifted. And people said, well, they were crazy kids. I don't think they were crazy kids. I looked at their writing, their journals, their thing. They were kids like the kids from Stanford. Were listening to that. I don't think anybody from Stanford went there because their parents were paying too much for their education. But it was very moving. They were not crazy kids. They were kids who were looking for something pure, something at a higher level, and that higher level was coming. And it was very tragic, and people did not understand the tragedy. But yes, it could have been predicted, and I predicted it, but you could see that was coming.
Yeah. Is there a parallel there, as you mentioned, with modern disclosure? you've got all these people that are seeing something that they want to see that is something better than what they think society is at the moment. Do is there a warning there for the modern disclosure adherents?
Well, that's in a way one of the. There is nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's one of the bases of religion. That you look at the sky, and in the sky you see something that looks perfect. As an astronomer, I can tell you it's not perfect. There's a bunch of atomic fusion reactions and explosions out there, but from if you look out at night, it looks perfect, and that's where salvation comes traditionally. So it's not it's something that's deeply ingrained in our culture.
Yeah.
In terms of these cult-like movements that you investigated in Messengers of Deception, I wanted to talk to you about one of my favorite stories in ufology, which is the UMO affair.
Yes.
Which is probably more popular in Latin American countries and Europe than it was in the United States. And you wrote Messengers of Deception before José Luis Jordán Peña came out and confessed that he was the author of the UMO letters, although nevertheless he always maintained that he had received help from the CIA or some intelligence group in order to pull out the hoax. So, I don't know, after all these years, do you think there is grounds to believe that there might have been some group, intelligence government group involved in this? And also, how do we explain the fact that the UMO symbol was reported in cases that have not been debunked, that seem totally genuine, which, for example, the famous Voronezh landing in the former Soviet Union in 1989?
So those are two different questions.
I know.
The UMO first got be known in Spain with a book by Antonio Ribera, who was a friend of mine, somebody I enjoyed very much working with, and one of the first investigators in Spain at the time when Spain was divided between, rationalists who were very much politically, inclined and had no interest in UFOs, and then very strong Catholic movement, the Opus Dei and everything else that wanted nothing to do with UFOs. So most UFO cases were repressed in Spain for a long time. Not anymore, as you know. But the UMO came in the middle of that as a proof, the tangible proof with photographs and devices and communications and a very complex book of astrophysics that could be translated from the Umaite language and so on. There were Umaite dictionaries. And, several of us tried to look at that seriously, including Dr. Poher, who looked at the text, and the text seemed to have some very advanced ideas in astrophysics. Well, I looked at that also along with Claude, and there are advanced ideas in astrophysics that are not necessarily published, but they are discussed, at seminars and so on. And there were the idea that from UMO were very, very similar to some ideas that some Russian astrophysicists had about multiple universes or about a double universe. Do we have a twin universe with which we can interact? And that idea is very interesting theoretically, but the question is, if it were like that, how would we know? I mean, what experiment could we design to communicate with that other universe? And there is nothing in physics that forbids it, by the way. You know, it could be right, but we didn't have any proof of it. But UMO pretended that they had proof of it, and that's why they could move the way they did. I thought, you know, very quickly came to the conclusion that this was a hoax because some of the supposed materials were not available. There were lots of lies. There were lots of, and so after a while, I wrote that book, you know, trying to dispel it, and I didn't look at it again until I found that the group that was behind it was also in Argentina, and
Mm-hmm.
you know that in a subsequent book, I had some pictures of the thing from Argentina and so on. So obviously it was a cult that was being populated within the Spanish-speaking world, both in South America and in Europe. But it did, after a while, it didn't really go anywhere. So the question is, it could be just some people having fun. It could be people who genuinely believe something and then are fed strange ideas by someone writing to them. I mean, I got anonymous letters from UMO in Paris and also in Chicago. So somebody at the time knew my address and sent me those anonymous letters. And they were covered with strange characters and they essentially repeated the same story. And they were mailed from strange places around the world. But, you know, if you have some friends, you can do that. You can, you know, stamp collectors do that all the time because they want to get stamps from all over the world. So I didn't take it very, very seriously. Other people continued to do investigation, and they ended up looking at a special unit of the Spanish police that might have been creating. So why would you do that? Well, for one thing, once you create this little cult, all you need is maybe 30 or 40 people around the world who believe in what you're sending them and are waiting for the next one. And you can use that to splice scientific ideas that are very advanced. That somebody there, so most of it is trivial, but some of it is very advanced in science. And then somebody could pick it up, and it could be a way of communicating with spies somewhere, covering it under something that everybody's going to throw into the trash can, except that, yeah, there's 50 pages of junk, but there is 2 paragraphs that are very important because they are new science. It could be a way of gathering information from different countries that are closed, or it could be a test of how many people will believe you if suppose that there is an emergency and you need to launch a precautionary idea to make people believe that everything's all right. How would you do it? What kind of strange group could you create quickly that would have your message? And so all those things are, you know, have been researched by sociologists. There are many books about that kind of thing. But UMO was very, very colorful, and that has been picked up again recently. There was an idea of that was populated through the space science circles in the U.S. that we were much more advanced than anybody thought, that we already had 15 people on Mars, that, we had all that. And that came from, we know now that this was a hoax from within the government, within the intelligence community.
It's Project Serpo, right? The Project Serpo hoax?
Yes. Right. It wasn't done as well as UMO. UMO had the astronomy right when they said which star they came from and so on. Serpo came, from a bunch of stars that couldn't, would never tolerate life. So there was, and the calculations were wrong. The calculations in UMO were not wrong. That's why Dr. Poher was intrigued, because you had to know some astrophysics to do it. Whoever did Serpo was, flunked astrophysics. Now, the other part of your question was, what about the UMO symbol in Voronezh? Well, if you look at the literature, which somebody did recently, there is an intelligent engine, software engine that has a lot of data about Voronezh and so on. But they, I went to Russia when it was still the Soviet Union, but nobody knew exactly what that meant in the days of Gorbachev. Okay, and I went there because of Voronezh, because everybody in the West was laughing at those, they thought it was a joke by the TASS agency. Well, I didn't think that was a joke. I thought something had happened in Voronezh from other sources. So I convinced a journalist at Le Figaro I knew I couldn't write to Russia, but Le Figaro was a highly respected newspaper, French newspaper in Russia. So we were actually invited there. And they told us that, they said, who do you want to meet with? And I said, we want to meet with investigators from Voronezh. So they actually shipped, they paid for a team of 5 people from Voronezh who had done the investigation to come meet with us in Moscow, and with their papers, with the photographs, with everything else. And one of the questions I had for them is, what about the UMO symbol? I mean, what is it doing? If you're telling us that this was real, that these objects showed up and there were these very strange phenomena around Voronezh, what about the UMO symbol? And they laughed and they said, look, there were some young investigators who, were very enthusiastic about UFOs, but they thought that for the message to be taken seriously in the West, there should be some symbol attached to it that's a veridical, a real symbol, of something extraterrestrial. So they painted the Voronezh symbol on a real photograph. And I wanted to tear my hair out. I said, why did they do that? I mean, they convinced everybody that it was a joke because those symbols, were discredited in the West. But they had read some book. They don't get all the books they want. And sociologically, that was just a perfect case. And then we looked at the data they had, and I think Voronezh was a very interesting case. For one thing, Voronezh is not a small town. Voronezh is over 1 million people and a major center of nuclear industry, nuclear power. in the old Soviet Union and the new Russia.
I know you have to go soon, Jacques, but I just need to hit you up on one more question. In Messengers, you spoke about having a synchronicity. Everyone kind of knows about it now, the name of Melchizedek. And then you kind of went on to pose this theory about an associative universe explains synchronicities. And I don't think people really grasped it at the time because you were a computer scientist, but many other people weren't into computers back then. But now in the modern day with search engines and website cookies and all that, we understand that idea a lot more, that doing something here might turn up over here in the same way, so, and I think it's just a beautiful way to explain how synchronicities might happen. I was just wondering if you've done any more work on that theory, or was it just something that you came up with and kind of left behind?
Well, more people have been reporting interesting synchronicities, very striking ones. And I've continued to notice when things like that happened to me. They were not as, clear and sensational as, but, some of them were what you have to sit up and, realize what's happening. You cannot just brush it off. And I thought, as most people take it as a signal of something, as a signal that they are doing something right, or that they've been chosen for something, which is fine, and maybe they're right, but I came to the conclusion that this happened by chance. But by a little bit more than chance, that you channel the chance in a certain way by selecting out of all the events that can happen, you're selecting events that match some sort of meta thinking that you're doing unconsciously. And it picks up, it makes these events happen. Now, as you know, there is another theory that we live in a simulation, and those are not, could be combined. If we live in a simulation, then my mind somehow could pick up the things in the simulation that precipitate alongside, what I'm interested in today. And that precipitation could be what I'm noticing. And that would be a natural phenomenon. It would not be something unusual. I mean, it would be unusual statistically, because that's not what happens to me all the time. But it could be precipitated out of a mechanism that doesn't really mean anything special for me in the future.
Yeah.
So that's the way I'm thinking about it now.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's been a real pleasure chatting to you today, Jacques. We really appreciate you taking the time. Like I said, Red Pill and I could just talk to you for 24 hours, I think. So we better let you go. Thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Thanks, both of you.